Hey guys, Britt here. Welcome to End Times Bible Prophecy. Today we're going to talk about a number of headlines, both directly and indirectly related to Bible prophecy. So let's dive right in. First, I want to talk about a question that's been on my mind for a number of years and has probably been on your mind, and that is the European Union the final world empire described in Daniel chapter 2? So this first article from Zero Hedge is going to help hopefully shed some light on where the European Union is going, and we may find an answer to that question here in the months or years ahead based on how the current crisis in Europe plays out. So the title of this first article is, "This is a Perfect Storm. EU Leader Warns of Black Swans Everywhere. Says Propaganda is Our Battlefield." "This is a perfect storm," exclaims European Commission Vice President Joseph Borrell in his opening speech to the EU ambassadors this week, having noted previously his warnings to the Fed that it is bringing us to a world recession. And I would keep in mind, yes, the U.S. Federal Reserve central bankers everywhere certainly had their role in global financial crisis from before any future recessions, but the world recession we're experiencing right now, I believe, and it's going to get much worse. The ground zero for that is Europe because of their poor energy policies and a lack of energy. It's going to cause this contagion impact all over the world. Anyway, Borrell went considerably further in a surprisingly frank and plain-speaking address. He began by warning that the world we are facing is a world of radical uncertainty. One after the other, things have happened that have had a very low probability of happening. Nevertheless, they happened, and they had a strong impact, and certainly they happened. And here he's describing these black swan events. They're supposed to be very rare and highly improbable events, but one after another has happened. The European Commission Vice President then goes on to try and summarize the extent of the European crisis and how they got there, admitting that they were entirely dependent on China for trade, Russia for energy, and the United States for security. "Our prosperity has been based on cheap energy coming from Russia and the access to the big China market for exports and imports, for technological transfers, for investments, for having cheap goods. Clearly today, we have to find new ways for energy from inside the European Union as much as we can, because we should not change one dependency for another." I believe this is key. So this is a high-ranking member of the European Union's elite, and he is acknowledging that the European Union is not the strong superstate that these elites envisioned. When the European Union concept was hatched, they had this idea: we are going to loom over the world stage, we're going to loom large, we are going to be the big one on the block. They don't want to play second fiddle to the United States, China, or Russia, yet today they find themselves dependent on all three and very weak. And so a lot of people have said, well, is this going to, and people have been talking for years about, will the European Union break apart? And that remains to be seen. But what we're seeing here is an acknowledgement that rather than breaking apart, we need to look to each other and become less dependent on these other nations. We need to look to ourselves to secure our energy supplies, to become resilient for our own economy and economic health, and for our own security on the military front. So could this crisis, instead of breaking apart the European Union, lead to further integration, perhaps a United States of Europe type concept? Because we have this common currency, so they share a common monetary policy through the European Central Bank and the use of the euro, but that's about it. Each nation has its own rules and regulations. There are some EU rules, obviously, and there's been many complaints about the bureaucracy of the European Union. But from nation to nation, you have different debt loads, and that causes a whole bunch of issues we're going to talk about in a moment. But here's this acknowledgement from European leaders, at least European leaders for the moment, that they need to strengthen themselves in these areas. Now, so they've recognized the problem they have, but what's this guy's solution? Well, we come down here, it says, finally, his solution to all this is simple. More propaganda. Right? So we need more propaganda. He says, communication is our battlefield. We fight in communication. Well, communication plays a role in all warfare, ancient as well as modern day warfare. But, you've got to do more than tweet, right? If you want to be a big player on the world stage, you need to do more than tweet. And he says, I need my delegations to step up on social media, on TV, in debates. I need you to be much more engaged in this battle of narratives, right? So what is his solution? His solution is, well, let's go out there on social media and we'll find out who is pointing out our inept leadership, and we'll censor them and we'll ban them, and we've got to win the battle of the narrative. Look, guys, if people can't eat and they can't heat their homes and they're freezing to death, I don't think there's any narrative that you can put forth that would convince them that those things are not happening. So if this current set of leadership in Europe can't get the job done, new leadership is coming. Now, whether it's the current crop of European elites or demagogues or some new class of political leadership that comes into being in Europe, who knows? But I think there is this growing recognition among all Europeans that if they want to be strong and resilient going forward, it may make more sense to unify rather than to break apart, to reform the European Union rather than scrap it. So that leads us into this next story, also from Zero Hedge. This is from Monday. It says, Germany backtracks, rejects earlier report on joint EU debt issuance after yields soar. So this says, Bloomberg reported that Chancellor Olaf Scholz will reverse a steadfast German position and support joint issuance of European Union debt to cushion the blow of the energy crisis, as long as the freshly raised money is dispersed to struggling member states as loans, not grants. Scholz signaled openness to use common borrowing on the sidelines of an EU summit in Prague last week, according to people familiar with the Chancellor's stance. The change in position follows criticism from other leaders that Germany's €200 billion national aid plan could trigger economic imbalances in the bloc. As Bloomberg adds, the issuance of joint debt would represent a dramatic about-face for the German government, which along with other countries, including the Netherlands, has pushed back against such measures. But calls to action have been increasing, reflecting concerns about the massive spending that will be needed for the EU to get through a winter without Russian gas and a transition to alternative energy supplies. So what's going on here? What's going on is, in the past, you've had issues with debt crises in the European Union nations because they all share a common currency, the euro. And therefore, each of those nations, the debt they take on is denominated in euros. But unlike the United States, unlike Japan, unlike the United Kingdom, they do not control the printing press as individual nations. The European Central Bank does. So when it gets to a point where their debt becomes too large, there's really only two ways they can address that: massive economic growth, or taxes. They can't simply print more euros to pay off that debt as the United States and Japan and the United Kingdom can. So it's created these problems. We saw it with the Greek debt crisis over a decade ago. We've heard issues about Italy and a debt crisis there, and they're too big to fail. It could break apart the European Union. Germany has always been against bailing out these other nations because they've told themselves, we've been fiscally responsible and prudent. Why should we bail out these nations that have these huge social programs and their economy isn't as efficient as ours? But something's changed. What's that? Well, Germany is short of energy. So they need that energy from those other nations aren't as short of as Germany is. So now all of a sudden they've changed their tune and are saying, well, maybe we should share things now. But the end result, regardless of what the motivation is this call for greater unity and taking this monetary union that's been in place in Europe for a couple of decades now and adding to it a fiscal union where you have a common EU debt, maybe treasury issuance, just like the United States has. We have 50 individual states, but there's also a national debt, and there's a national fiscal policy, and it helps to eliminate some of these economic imbalances that they mention here in the bloc. And so there will be a lot of support if Germany's on board for further financial and economic integration of the European Union. What will that mean? What does that mean? That we are looking at a European superstate that will loom large on the world stage, because economically, if they can get this together, the European Union will be the largest economy in the world. And so we're seeing this push for greater integration of military power so they can have their own security in their own hands and not be dependent on the United States for it. But then the question becomes, okay, how do they get the energy independence from Russia, from the United States? Because they don't necessarily have the resources in-house to do that. So that remains to be seen. But that is the direction this is moving, and it will be interesting to see how this plays out. Will we see the European Union fall apart and it has nothing to do with Bible prophecy? Or will we see it integrate together? And I believe that there's a lot of parallels between the empire described in Daniel chapter 2 of weak and strong nations trying to form an alliance to strengthen themselves, but they don't fit together so well. It's a very volatile alliance. Like iron and clay don't fit together. We've seen this back and forth with the EU over several decades now. Is this the next step toward a greater unified Europe? It remains to be seen, but this is one we want to keep our eyes on, because as we go into this winter, there's going to be crisis, an energy crisis. There's going to be financial crisis. This is going to be a time of great change for Europe for the rest of this year and well into 2023. So on to our next story. This is from Al Jazeera. It says Russia's Putin hails ties as he meets United Arab Emirates president. Russian President Vladimir Putin has hailed his country's ties with the United Arab Emirates during a meeting with the Gulf state's leader and welcomed a recent decision by oil-producing nations to limit production as key to stabilizing the global energy market. And it goes on to talk about how they talked about the war in Ukraine and the recent OPEC decision to cut production, and they're all buddy-buddy and on board. But what this meeting is really about, that they don't even address in this market, is about Putin's desire to create a new OPEC, one for natural gas instead of oil. We went over this before. Russia and Iran are already in a pact trying to do just that. And the key player that they need to get on board is the United Arab Emirates. If they can get the United Arab Emirates to join in coalition with them, then they will dominate pipeline-delivered natural gas and liquefied natural gas delivery. and they may very well be able to set the price on the world stage, which would put them in a very strong position economically and in terms of this valuable energy commodity. So this remains to be seen. And then, of course, we know a threat to that is Israel, and they're developing as a natural gas power on the world stage. So could that end up being a reason, the motivation for the Gog of Magog war outlined in Ezekiel 38 and 39? Because we know that the motivation for that is to take plunder. Could natural gas be that plunder? Again, we'll wait and see, but that's what this meeting is really about with the United Arab Emirates. It's about natural gas. It has nothing to do with oil and OPEC Plus or Ukraine. It has to do with natural gas and building that OPEC of natural gas nations. So on to this next story. This is from Politico. It says EU Commission downplays food shortage fears amid energy price surge. No reason to be alarmist about food shortages, top official says. No reason to be alarmist, right? So if you run out of food, don't worry about it. There's no reason for alarm there. It says a top European Commission official played down fears that soaring energy costs could cause food shortages in the coming months after MEPs warned Tuesday about the economic pressure farmers are facing. Farmers have seen the price of artificial fertilizer skyrocket amid a wider energy crisis across Europe because natural gas, a fossil fuel, is a major ingredient in nitrogen-based fertilizers. Clearly, there's an issue here, but we need to look at it in perspective, said Michael Scannell, deputy head of the Commission's Agriculture Department. Scannell was addressing concerns voiced by members of the European Parliament's Agriculture Committee, such as Romania's Daniel Buda from the European People's Party, who said there could be a very serious food crisis if the EU fails to take urgent measures to mitigate the rising fertilizer cost in the coming months, especially since farmers are now sowing their winter wheat crops. We have 500 million consumer citizens in the EU. They must be fed, and I'm very worried, Buda said during the committee meeting, warning small-scale farms could go bust if the EU does not step in. Scannell said the Commission is regularly analyzing the agricultural markets at a granular level. We're very close to the ground, and the evidence to date doesn't give us reason to be alarmist, he said. The Commission is pondering whether to remove anti-dumping tariffs on imports of liquid fertilizer from countries like Russia in order to increase the supply of fertilizers on the European market. However, that would remove the protection for the European fertilizer producers. I'll ask him, what European fertilizer producers? You've driven them all out of business with your insane energy policies. The production is a fraction of what it was just a few months ago, much less a year ago. So, but they have these tariffs on imports to avoid anti-dumping, which really means we don't want cheap fertilizer coming in here, inexpensive fertilizer. Why wouldn't you want inexpensive fertilizer? Everybody would love to have that right now, but this is how insane these policies are. So it says lifting anti-dumping measures on imports alone would not make a significant dent in reducing fertilizer prices for EU farmers in any case, he said. So don't worry, don't be alarmist. There's no fertilizer crisis. We don't have to worry about that, right? That's what he's telling us. Only the UN Secretary General disagrees. It says the United Nations concerned shortage of fertilizers might affect global food supply. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres Wednesday discussed the issue of fertilizers and food exports with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Portugal-born Guterres said he focused his talks on the availability of the chemicals in short supply, which might affect food production later this year, to remove the obstacles that still exist in relation to the export of Russian fertilizers is absolutely essential at the present moment, he explained. he added that it was necessary to facilitate Russia's food and fertilizer shipments to avert a global food crisis. So, which one is it? Should we not be alarmed? It's no big deal. Don't worry about it. Or is it absolutely essential to avert a global food crisis? We're not really getting the answer here from, this EU Commission guy, but we're getting it from the UN, I guess, at least in this instance. Now, we're heading into, again, we've talked about this food crisis, and this is underscored by this Freight Waves article that regardless of the fertilizer, which of course they're telling us, oh, we don't need this fertilizer, the shortfall in fertilizer, don't worry about it. We didn't really use that anyway, right? We didn't use that stuff. So even though we've got less of it for the winter wheat crop, no big deal. It was just for show. We just like spending that extra cash in the past to buy that stuff. Yeah. It has an impact on yield. It'll have an impact on how much is produced. They don't want to tell us that. So that's going to cause problems with the availability of agricultural commodities worldwide. And then we hit this article from Freight Waves that says, latest supply chain crisis could threaten global stash of food. You probably don't spend much time thinking about barges. This is something you ought to change. The barge industry is quite important. It's crucial for moving aluminum, petroleum, fertilizer, and coal, particularly on the Mississippi River and its tributaries. About 60% of the grain and 54% of the soybeans for U.S. export are moved via the noble barge. Barges touch more than a third of our exported coal as well. Right now, the barge industry, and all of us who depend on its wares, is mired in a crisis. Water levels on the Mississippi River Basin are at its lowest point in more than a decade. The timing for such a drought is pretty bad. Right now is harvest season, so farmers are looking to move their wares. Ongoing labor strife on the nation's railways also renders that backup network uncertain. Halted or slowed barge traffic is worrisome for the world at large too. American exports of coal are key right now as Europe faces a massive energy crisis heading into winter. Any snags threaten to disrupt trade at a time when coal demand is soaring as Europe weathers an energy crisis exacerbated by Russia's war in Ukraine. Exports of grain and soybeans are also important right now because we're facing a shortage of those commodities amid the war in Ukraine. So we have lower water levels in the Mississippi, and it's keeping these agricultural commodities as well as coal and petroleum from flowing out for export. And we see this in this Zero Hedge article from yesterday. It says massive bean piles spotted up and down Mississippi River as barges can't meet harvest demand. And here we got this giant bean pile over here. It's covered by a tarp. Same here. There's one in Tunica, Mississippi. This giant bean pile. And then we see here trucks that are being utilized instead of the barges because the farmers can't get their crops to market via barge, so they're having to use trucks. It's backing up trucking. Here we've got a picture of just how bad the water level has gotten in some parts of the Mississippi. This is in Vicksburg. Here we see another picture. So this is going to it's just one more. Just as Joseph Burrell said earlier, we see all these black swan events, one after another, one after another. Well, they all add up. In and of themselves, they may not be highly significant, but when you add them all up, they make a big difference. And this is going to make a big difference in the amount of food that is available to the world. We're heading into a food crisis. We haven't talked about it as much recently, but going into the end of this year and well into 2023, there is simply not going to be enough food available to feed everybody in the world. And we're already starting to see this happen. This is from the Associated Press. It says, empty shelves or unaffordable food, Tunisia's crisis deepens. Tunisians have been hit with soaring food prices and shortages of basic staples in recent weeks, threatening to turn simmering discontent in the North African country, the cradle of the Arab Spring protest, into larger turmoil. Sugar, vegetable oil, rice, and even bottled water periodically disappear from supermarkets and grocery stores. People stand in line for hours for these food essentials that have long been subsidized and are now increasingly available in rations only. When they do appear on shelves, many people cannot afford to pay the staggering price for them. And we see pictures of these empty shelves. Fights sometimes break out at food market queues, and scattered protests and sporadic clashes with police over rising prices and shortages have occurred around the country. In a suburb of the capital, Tunis, a young itinerant fruit vendor recently killed himself after police seized the scales he used to weigh his wares. So guys, this is going to create, we're seeing this food crisis start to hit. And where is it going to hit? Well, it's going to hit places like Tunisia. This article says here, food isn't the only thing in short supply. Lacking energy resources like those in neighboring Libya and Algeria, Tunisia relies heavily on imports, and its long-running economic troubles means it has limited leverage in international markets to secure the goods it needs. We've gone over this in the past. This is not a food crisis where wherever you live, everybody's going to be starving. That's not what's going to happen. Some people are not even going to notice that there's a food crisis. If they ignore the news, they wouldn't know. And if the news ignores it, they won't know. But this is not going to be evenly distributed. It's going to be dependent on where you are. And if you live in a country like Tunisia, where you are dependent upon imports to meet your agricultural and your energy needs, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And that's what we're seeing here with Tunisia. It's what we're going to see in a whole host of other countries that are already on the brink of famine right now for those same reasons. And they are not going to be able to compete on the international market with the wealthier countries. So, for instance, a country like Japan, they're very dependent on imports of energy and food to meet their needs as well. But they have a much more vibrant economy, so they can afford to pay more on the open market and bid those prices up. And when they bid those prices up, nations like Tunisia won't be able to get what they need. And we're going to have an epic crisis where food is not getting to the people who need it. So that's what's coming, guys. That's what's coming. So I wish I had better news. You know, it seems like every day is just bad news, bad news, bad news. But keep in mind, as we've stated over and over, there is good news. And the good news is all of this was foreseen by God, and Jesus is coming soon, right? So we live in the season of the Lord's return. Jesus said, when you see all these things happen, know I'm right at the door. I'm coming back soon. Jesus is our hope. That's where our trust is. That's where our joy is. So we don't have to be overly concerned with these stories. Yes, we need to know what's going on in the world. We're commanded to watch. But hold your head up high. Just keep doing the work that God put you on this earth to do. He made us for times such as these. So go out, preach the gospel, do what you can to help your neighbors, your family, everybody around you, and just eagerly await and look forward to the day when Jesus returns, because it's going to be any day now. I don't know when it's going to be, next week, next month, next year, 5 years from now. I don't know. But I know that we're very near. We can see the finish line. So we need to be running the race of our lives right now to do everything God put us here to do. So what do you think? Leave your comments below. Make sure to like and share this. God willing, I'll see you on Monday. Bye. If you want to learn more about the end times and Bible prophecy, make sure to sign up for my free monthly newsletter and get your copy of my free ebook, 7 Signs of the End Times. Just follow the link in the description to get your free book. Also, make sure to check out all of my books. Just look up Britt on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple iBooks, Google Books, Kobo, or anywhere books are sold. Thanks for watching today, and until next time, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith.